Welcome to the podcast, Scattered, One Person's Search for the Story Behind Human Remains. My name is Yvonne Chorlin. I'm a physical anthropologist and archaeologist. In other words, I like dead people. In this podcast, I explore topics related to dead people, from searching for human remains in forensic contexts to mortuary practices in modern and archaeological contexts, and everything in between. I offer information, perspectives, and insights directly from the mouths of researchers, as well as experiences of people who work with remains. All of this aims to provide you with information on subjects that aren't really talked about, don't seem to be a priority, or they can be very misunderstood. I hope you enjoy. Hello and welcome. In today's interview, I talked to Kimberlee Moran from Rutgers University about the ethics of working with human remains. But first, a couple updates. Last time, in the previous episode, I mentioned that we, Sherry, Chris, and I, submitted a paper to the Journal of Forensic Sciences about our findings about the scavenger guilds in the Alberta portion of the scavenger study. If you want to find out more about the scavenger study, you can listen through other episodes of this podcast, episodes 7, 9, and 16. And you can also go to my website, yvonnechorlin.com/scavenging-study. We have received reviewer comments on this paper and revised the paper accordingly. Hopefully that paper will be accepted before year's end and I can share with you an open access version. Then it'll be on to me writing the dispersed remains portion of our results. And so much for my Christmas break. I have just returned from the 50th in-person annual meeting of the Canadian Association for Biological Anthropology, which was in Winnipeg, or Winterpeg. It seems the weather was fine until I got there, and then the snow started, and it didn't stop. My boots are still drying out. There were a couple of sessions at the meeting on forensic anthropology and archaeology, with other sessions focusing on ancient or historic populations or primatology. It was also really good to see a session focusing on being socially responsive and responsible biological anthropologists. And that fits quite nicely with the interview that I bring you in this episode. My talk at the conference, Start with the Why, How Research in Scattered Remains Turned into a Podcast, seemed to be well received, and maybe some of the audience members are now listening to this episode. So hello and welcome. Because I'm an advocate for making information accessible and available, I hope to record my talk as soon as I can, as soon as I'm back from yet another conference, so that you can listen to it at your leisure with no paywalls. In my talk, I brought up that I had started this podcast to make a change in the world. I really want people to know more about the dead, about dispersed remains, and about all this wonderful, rich, valuable information that is published in research journals and that is not available to everyone. However, I don't know if this podcast is making the difference in the world that I want it to make unless you tell me a bit about yourself. Why do you listen? What are you learning from listening? And if this podcast is helping you? Tell me if this podcast is making a change in your world. So I've made a very short survey that is all about you. So tell me why you're listening and what you found useful and what you'd like to hear about next. Tell me by filling out the survey. It's only about 5 questions. And to sweeten the pot, if you complete the survey with your email address, you'll be entered into a draw to win the ebook version of my novel, Memoirs of a Reluctant Archaeologist. Draw will be done on December 1st, 2023, so make sure you fill it out before then and include your email address. If you find this podcast and the information in it useful, please do consider supporting the podcast by donating. You can donate through Buy Me a Coffee. Buy Me a Coffee is a platform through which you can donate the cost of a coffee, $5 or $10 or whatever. And the money goes directly to me to support my time. My time on this podcast is significant. I spend a lot of time reading journal articles and books to find interviewees and to stay current in the fields of bioarchaeology, forensic anthropology, and many, many other disciplines. I also do the post-production of the podcast, including editing the transcripts. So if you enjoy this podcast, please consider buying me a coffee. The link is in the show notes and also on my website, yvonnechorlin.com. That's YVONNEKJORLIEN.com. If you want to ask me a question, absolutely. I'd love to hear from you. You can reach out to me through my website, yvonnechorlin.com. You can email me at ychorlin@gmail.com. That's YKJORLIEN@gmail.com. Or contact me through my Facebook page, The Reluctant Archaeologist. And you can also stalk me on Instagram at Yvonne Chorlin. You can also comment on the podcast through my website and YouTube. Reach out and tell me what you think of the show and what you're learning about dead people. Now here's the interview with Kimberlee.
Okay. My name is Kimberlee Moran. I'm an associate teaching professor and director of forensics at Rutgers University in Camden.
And where is Camden, just for all the people in the world who are not up on the U.S. geography?
So Rutgers University is the State University of New Jersey. It has 3 campuses. Its flagship campus is kind of smack in the center of the state in New Brunswick. And then it has 2 satellite campuses, one in Newark, New Jersey, which is kind of more of its urban campus, and then Camden, New Jersey. And Camden, New Jersey is by far the smallest of the 3 campuses. And so we have very much kind of a small liberal arts college kind of feel. We're in the southern portion of the state, basically right across the river from Philadelphia.
Oh, so you're right in that northeast corner of the U.S.
It's a great place to be. Lots going on.
I imagine autumn there is just beautiful.
Yeah, it really is. And
oh, wow.
For me, so my background is forensic archaeology. I started off my career as an archaeologist. I studied the Greeks, the Romans, Mesopotamia. Never in a million years did I ever think I was going to be doing forensic science. I did end up in the forensic world as a master's student and have never looked back, although I still do a lot of work in traditional archaeology as well. So half of the time I have one foot in the past, half of the time I have one foot in the present. I'm working in both kind of modern criminal justice and crime scene investigation, but then every now and again I swing back to my roots in archaeology. So being in New Jersey is a wonderful place. It's very, very good forensically because we're right smack in the middle of major metropolitan areas that have really excellent forensic laboratories and forensic systems, but also archaeologically, it is a very historically rich and archaeologically rich area to be. So I get the best of both worlds being in New Jersey.
And now I was recently having a conversation with somebody about sort of the premise of modern archaeology and the way that I guess the call for archaeology nowadays isn't so much that we, go out and willy-nilly dig up heritage or historical sites. It's more of a salvage. We need to rescue the sites from impending doom because of construction or some other kind of destruction.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of different things going on. I mean, one thing that I really appreciate about our modern approaches to archaeology is we are grounding archaeology much more robustly in the sciences. And we're really applying a lot of scientific principles, scientific approaches, and scientific testing to what we do within archaeology. So, back in the day, as you say, it was kind of like willy-nilly, let's just go find some cool stuff. But now it's like, okay, what are some research questions that we have? Like, what is it that we really want to learn about this site and this material? And then what are the methods that we're going to employ to actually ensure that we're answering those research questions? So there's that kind of aspect, kind of, bringing archaeology more in line with other science fields. But also kind of, as you say, this idea of salvage, it's a little bit more about stewardship, because archaeological resources are finite. They will not last forever, particularly if they're impacted by human action. And so we're thinking about more of how we preserve archaeological material, preserve that cultural heritage for future generations. And then in instances where we can't just leave it in the ground, leave it alone, how do we, again, kind of rescue it and ensure that it's being adequately stewarded, not just the artifacts that we, that come out of the ground, but the knowledge that comes out of the ground as well.
Right. Yeah. And I'm I'm always floored by what we do nowadays compared to what is glorified and portrayed in the movies and media and what have you about, just going out, the archaeologists going out and digging up treasure. They're looking for treasure.
Right,
And
right. And
whether or
we've
not the museum gets it back, and then, if the museum gets it, well, then it's kind of in the gilded cage.
right.
The people that artifact or the site belongs to, they never get to see it again. And yeah, it's behind this plate glass. Nobody touches it. Be lucky if you ever get to study it.
Sure. I mean, we've just recently had another Indiana Jones film, right?
Yeah.
And for my generation, we grew up on Indiana Jones. Many of us are in archaeology because of Indiana Jones. And, I also see this in my forensic career as well, right? We have all these CSI, all these flavors of CSI programming. And many students are in my classroom because they've watched, all those CSI shows and they think, that that's their portrayal of what a crime scene investigator or a forensic scientist does. So, these shows are great for generating interest in the respective fields and maybe, inspiring people to go into them. But yeah, obviously they're not accurate representations. And there's a lot of responsibility that we have as archaeologists to interact with the public and to kind of bring a more realistic version of archaeology and to, kind of dismantle that idea of the gilded cage of museum collections and museums, and really bring the collections out to the general public and have them make that connection of the present with the past. One of the things about museums is only about 5% of everything a museum has in its collection is ever on display. So there are just troves of material that never see the light of day, that are just in storage. Part of that is because it's stuff that might not be particularly interesting to the general public, like mounds and mounds of shards of broken pottery and things like that. Whoever's curating it might think, okay, well, nobody really wants to see just like a pile of what looks like trash. Archaeology is just kind of historic trash picking in a way. And so, again, it's really important to connect people with what's going on behind the scenes in museums, because these collections are accessible. They're there for research and further study. And even members of the general public have access to those collections if there is something that they're studying and they're researching. So there's a lot going on behind the scenes in museums. But yeah, again, typically on a day-to-day basis, we just don't see that other world.
Yeah. And so that kind of brings us around. The reason I wanted Kimberlee on the podcast was to talk about ethics of working with human remains, because there's been sort of a shift in perspective, I think over the past 10 years at least. It used to be okay to work with human remains, and not just okay, but more desirable, because you need to work with the remains in the classroom so that you can effectively work with the remains when you're out into the real world. So you know what to look for, you know how it feels, and it just makes you better at what you're going to be doing. But nowadays, there's just people are kind of almost putting a ban on working with human remains, especially in archaeology, anthropology. So I wanted to talk about that. And you have this lovely little story about, was it Philadelphia? You were working on you had heard about some human remains found in Philadelphia. Is that the way it goes?
Sure. So first of all, just kind of taking a step back, historically, anthropologists and archaeologists, and I'm going back, 100 or more years, have had a very cavalier approach to human remains. This kind of idea that bones are cool. And there have been a lot of pretty terrible things that have happened within archaeology and anthropology in terms of the treatment of human remains, the acquisition of human remains, particularly of kind of vulnerable populations. We've got a long and horrible history in the United States of how we have addressed the remains of indigenous peoples that have very strong feelings about death and what is appropriate to happen to the human body. And, archaeologists in the past have just completely disregarded that and trophy hunted, essentially. And over the generations, we've really taken a good hard look at ourselves and our profession, and have really kind of tightened up our approach to human remains. So this really came to a head in the 1990s when we passed legislation in the United States to protect the graves and the cultural heritage of Native Americans. So NAGPRA is the name of the law that protects and helps to repatriate cultural material related to Indigenous people and their human remains. But that's kind of the only legal framework that has ever been put in place in the United States in terms of the treatment of this kind of material. So while we've gotten a lot better and we've really established some good ethical frameworks, we only have that one legal framework. And you still get kind of the spectrum within bioarchaeology, anthropology, forensic anthropology of the use and the treatment of human remains. So in terms of my own work, and I have really, my thinking has really shifted over the years as well. But back in 2016, I was on the train to work one day, and I'm an avid newspaper reader, and I opened up the newspaper and I saw this article that was entitled "Old Bones Found and Nobody's in Charge." And it was a story of a construction site in Philadelphia. Bones were coming out of the ground, and everyone kind of raised their hand and said, "Oh, not my problem, has nothing to do with me or my agency." So the medical examiner's office was called. They established that these were historic human remains, so nothing legal or forensic, nothing to do with them. The historical commission was then turned to, and they said, well, this site lies outside of a registered historical district, so nothing really to do with us either. And then finally, the site was a private construction project, so there were no kind of public funds involved. And so other protections that might be in place at kind of the state level also did not apply. So it very much fell into this gray area. And part of the article was this picture of the site foreman looking kind of unhappy, and he was holding this box of bones. And it only took a glance to realize that these very much were human bones, human remains. So this is 2016, and I'm thinking to myself, gee, I'd love a box of bones. I could do something with a box of bones. I'd at least like to know more about, what's in that box. So I was a little worried that I might kind of sound like a weirdo if I just called up the construction company and said, hey, give me your box of bones, right? Yeah, probably that wouldn't go over so well. So I contacted a friend of mine who's the curator of the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia. The Mutter Museum is a museum dedicated to medical history. They currently have a lot of human remains on display. That might not be forever. But the Mutter Museum has, a very well-known reputation in the city. And I thought, well, if someone from the Mutter Museum called, that would look way more legit than just me calling. So I reached out to my friend and I shared her the article and I said, hey, we should get this box of bones and find out what's here and try to understand why there are bones coming out of the site in the first place. And is there going to be, are we likely to encounter more human remains? So she wasn't particularly interested. And then I kind of uttered the famous last words that to this day I regret. I texted her, don't worry, I'll do all the work.
Those are very famous last words.
Yes. Oh, and man, have I gotten that back in spades. So again, to make a very long story short, we got the box of bones and we came to find that this site was the former First Baptist Church of Philadelphia cemetery. And according to all the historical records out there, it shouldn't be there anymore. There shouldn't be any human remains. In 1860, it was relocated to a kind of large public open space kind of cemetery called Mount Moriah, which is kind of in the southern part of the city, kind of close to what's now the Philadelphia airport. The church had relocated. It was originally on 2nd Street. It had moved a couple of times, and nobody was really looking after their burial ground. There were indications from newspapers at the time and from church records that the cemetery had really fallen into disrepair. There were tenement houses that surrounded the cemetery, and people were just throwing their daily garbage into the cemetery, and it had gotten into quite a state. So the First Baptist Church in the 1850s bought a plot in this Mount Moriah cemetery, and they put lots of public notices in the newspapers saying, we are digging up our old burial ground and we are relocating to this new place. And if you have any family members buried here, contact this guy Loxley and, get it sorted out. And there's also newspaper articles of the actual work in progress. In fact, there were some interesting observations of how well preserved individuals were. They would open up a coffin of somebody who had died 30 plus years ago, and family members were still able to recognize the individual.
Wow.
So that's very interesting, right? But again, this cemetery should not still be here at 2nd and Arch Street in Philadelphia. So initially we thought that maybe these were just a few individuals that had been missed, or maybe these were individuals that didn't have next of kin, so they just left them alone. So our initial approach to the site, once we got permission from the property developer, who did not want to have to be dealing with any of this, but they let us come on site just to monitor the overall, excavation with the backhoe. They were putting in a 2-story parking garage. And because they were going so deep into the ground, this is why they were encountering, these remains that were left behind. So what started off as what we thought was just a salvage excavation turned into a full-fledged archaeological excavation. And ultimately, in the end, around about 500 individuals have been excavated from this site. And there are still more. Yes, there are still more that are under existing structures. After doing our research, we know that we have at least 1,700 named individuals that were buried in this burial ground, but we may have up to 3,000 burials in the burial ground.
That's more than just missing a few individuals.
Right, exactly, exactly. So Mr. Loxley clearly did not do his job in 1860. Again, we now have evidence as to why that happened. But we became the stewards of nearly 500 sets of human remains. We can talk more about some of the legal things later on, but we were given permission by the courts in Philadelphia that oversee unclaimed remains to study those remains for approximately 5 years, try to identify any of them if we could, and then all the remains were to be reburied in September 2023. Now it is now October 2023, and those remains are in my building just next door, and have not been reburied yet. And we can kind of circle back as to why that is. But that's, that has been, what turned out to what originally started as a box of bones ended up being a whole cemetery, something that we never anticipated in a million years. What we thought was just going to be a very discreet little research project ended up being, 5 to 6 years of our lives. And I say our because this has now become a real kind of collaborative initiative. It's expanded way beyond myself. But yes, it has dominated our lives for at least 6 years and is not over yet.
Well, because our previous conversations before the recording, we talked about some of the legal and ethical issues that came up with that. Let's take a step back because when we were talking before, you told me about the MOVE group, and I had always wondered kind of why we are now at the place we are with this whole perspective on not at all using human remains in any research in any study. You can't even use them in pictures and all that kind of stuff. And where did that come from? And I, because I'm probably around the same generation as you, and, we were brought up with using real human remains in the lab, in the classroom. That's what you learned on. And you learned how human remains felt. And but now the pendulum is swinging quite the opposite way, where not even human remains in pictures. So where did that all come from? And you were saying it's from the MOVE group. So tell us about that.
Well, so really, there's kind of a culmination of multiple things at play. We're in a
Right.
really
Yeah, that's usually the way it
complicated
is.
time in history right now. So, first of all, we have everything that's happened from the pandemic and from, everything that's happened post George Floyd, and a much heightened sense of social justice, which is really wonderful, right? Like we really need that. And so we're a lot more aware of all the various kind of groups that have been oppressed and have been neglected, and all the things that we as white people have just kind of taken for granted. And so that's part of it, is just kind of having our heads in a different space where we're really paying more attention to things than we ever did before. The other side of it, and again, it really has come into this interesting moment of history, is something again that happened in Philadelphia. A couple of things that have happened in Philadelphia, and one of those is the discovery that some human remains that from a pretty horrible incident that I'll describe in a minute, were never returned to the next of kin. So back in the 1980s, there was a kind of social group called MOVE, capital MOVE. And they kind of lived kind of communally. The kind of main portion of this group took over a block in Philadelphia. They had kind of communal raising of their children. They all kind of changed their surnames to Africa. There was, they were trying to be self-sufficient in terms of like growing their own food and various things like that. And they had a lot of negative interactions with the police, and also some of the neighbors as well. But they were well known to the police, and individuals were kind of regularly arrested and various things like that. So in the 1980s, there was really a kind of watershed moment where the police department in Philadelphia decided to, and this is not an exaggeration, they decided to drop a bomb on the compound from a helicopter. So you can look this up in the newspapers at the time or more recently. So a bomb was dropped on this city block in Philadelphia. Obviously, there was a huge fire. Lots of people from the movement died as a result of everything kind of going up in flames. And a number of those individuals were children. So after the fire was put out and the medical examiner and death investigators came to process the scene and collect any human remains, there were quite a few charred human remains that were recovered and sent to the medical examiner's office. The medical examiner worked with several anthropologists based at the University of Pennsylvania. And, this is pretty routine. Even today, the medical examiner kind of works with outside anthropologists when there are skeletonized human remains. And for whatever reason, some of these remains, 2 bones of children, were retained by the anthropologists. And the anthropologists used them in classes, used images of them in public lectures. And, the identities of these remains were known, and the next of kin to these remains were known. And yet these remains were retained. There was also another box of remains that were later found in the medical examiner's office that the medical examiner was trying to kind of quietly cremate and dispose of, but they were found as well. So relatively recently, within the past couple of years, it came to light that these remains had been moving around to different institutions, used in, again, very cavalier and kind of callous way, and clearly never any intention by the anthropologist to ever return them to the next of kin. So it has caused, it's been a massive incident in Philadelphia. There are regularly newspaper articles about this and kind of the next, iteration of the saga. And it has sent ripples across the anthropology, bioarchaeology community. In conjunction to that, the University of Pennsylvania has, for many, many years, have a collection of skulls called the Morton Collection. And Morton was a very unapologetic racist, and he collected all of these skulls to basically show that the brain capacity of non-whites was smaller than white individuals. And so it's come to light that many of these skulls were kind of grave robbed, or they come from enslaved individuals, various things that, again, just cast even more of a shadow on this collection of remains. So again, lots of negative press for the University of Pennsylvania. And unfortunately, it's been that negative press that has really kind of caused a lot of fear and trepidation amongst the larger community. So rather than kind of digging deep into the issues and determining what is and isn't appropriate and having some conversations and maybe coming up with a framework, just again, kind of out of fear of what could happen and the articles that could come out, there's been this kind of retraction within the community of, pulling inwards and, I'm putting in air quotes, cleaning up what we have and just kind of pretending, kind of sweeping things under a rug. That's kind of how I feel, is that rather than just coming straight out, let's talk about this. It's more kind of, let's just make this problem quietly go away. And yeah, that's kind of where we are at the moment. So it's a really challenging environment. And I think we have a lot of work to do to kind of come out of this in a productive way that allows us to continue to train our students and prepare them for work in the field, to continue good research, good ethical research, and to also continue having good practices within museums that have collections of human remains. There's a lot of work that we still need to do.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of that, the past work, because frankly, I'm not too sure that there's a scientific discipline out there that doesn't have kind of a shadowy past where, there's at least a few individuals that were not doing right things or good things. And, what's the discipline to do about that shadowy past? But
right.
I think as archaeologists and bioanthropologists, we've kind of got our work cut out for us.
But it's, at the same time that there's a lot of fear, this could actually be a very exciting point in history for us to be doing this work. Like, I find it very kind of intellectually stimulating and also morally stimulating to want to jump in and engage in this and have these discussions. I think we do ourselves a disservice by not just kind of facing these issues head on.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I fully agree with you on that. I look at this as what lessons are we to learn from this?
Yeah, definitely.
And how can we move forward in a productive manner that we can all live with?
Yeah. And this is a great teaching moment for our students. Let's pull our students in and make them part of this conversation, because they are the anthropologists and bioarchaeologists of the future.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I asked you in an email about this, sort of how much does personal integrity play into professional ethics? Because we're not only dealing with perhaps a generational perspective of these anthropologists who are, circulating the world with these two children's bones from the move group. So, maybe a generational integrity and their perspective there, but also, a sense of professional ethics that's becoming more and more, I guess, I want to say, I don't know if it's concrete, but definitely more distinct in anthropology. But then there's also a profession or personal integrity as well.
Yeah.
Maybe the morals and values part of that. So yeah, how does that all play in?
Right. So, the personal integrity is what makes you care in the first place, and what makes you want to address these issues. When you don't have that personal integrity, that's when these bad things happen. But at the same time, you have professional ethics, which really kind of codify a set of standards within the discipline. So even if you don't care, there should be a framework within which you have to work because you are part of this profession. You have signed up to be members of particular associations. So, we have the Society for American Archaeology. We have the American Association of Physical Anthropologists. We have lots of different organizations, the American Academy of Forensic Science that has an anthropology section. We have lots of organizations that if you are part of those organizations, you have agreed to follow the code of professional ethics that they have set out. And different organizations have, they all have basically the same general ethical principles, but different organizations are more kind of direct in what they say you should do as opposed to others. So some professional organizations just basically say, don't do bad things, don't, misrepresent your credentials, very, very kind of generalized. Whereas other professional organizations really say, these are our values and these are the things that you need to abide by if you're going to be part of this community. So, we take our personal integrity and we take those folks that care and we build professional ethics that then we all have to abide by, but there will still sometimes be gaps. And that's where you get kind of the spectrum of, interpretation of how, I guess I should say, how far we should go in terms of what we do with human remains.
So let's take that and talk about what you went through with the construction site, the Baptist
Sure.
Church in Philadelphia, because it was a gray area, you said,
Right.
and there was some legal and ethical stuff going on before you were allowed to work with the remains.
Yeah, there was a lot of stuff. So, first of all, we've got, the legal gray area where, nobody is regulating what's happening here. Because this is a private project, it falls outside of preservation regulations and things of that nature. And again, initially we just thought, oh, here are a few leftover remains. We had no idea of the scope of what we were dealing with. So one of the things that became apparent very early on is that the construction company they weren't going to allow us to do good archaeology. They were kind of placating us by allowing us to be on site to just monitor the backhoe. And when the backhoe hit human remains, we had, a few minutes to stop the backhoe, take a few pictures to document, location and context, basically hand excavate the remains and put them into a box to then go someplace else. And then the backhoe would just continue to work. Like we weren't allowed, construction was not stopped because we had no authority to stop it. And there wasn't anybody with authority that was interested in getting involved in this situation. And if we annoyed the construction company at any point, they could tell us to leave and, and then nothing was going to happen. No salvage, no protection was going to happen. So that was our first ethical issue is, what is worse, bad archaeology or no archaeology at all? We were reaching out to various organizations, trying to get some guidance on what we should do, but again, still trying to kind of be on the down low because we knew that at any point we could get kicked off the site and that would be the end of it. And one of the archaeologists that we spoke to point blank told us to walk away, that we should have nothing to do with this. We were going to set Philadelphia archaeology back by 30 years. And we said to this archaeologist, look, like, if we're not there, these things are getting thrown away. We know that they're being mashed up by construction machinery and they're going into big dump trucks to be taken off site with all the dirt that they're trying to remove. Like, how can we in good conscience allow that to happen? And the archaeologist had no answer for us, just continue to reiterate that we shouldn't be involved. The rationale of why we shouldn't be involved is because being involved gave the construction company a veneer of legitimacy. They could say, look, we're doing the right thing. We're working with archaeologists, even though clearly we were not producing a good archaeological product here.
Right.
So I understand where she was coming from, but for my personal integrity, I couldn't leave that site knowing what would happen in our absence. So we made the decision to continue to be involved, even though all of us were kind of terrified that this was going to be the end of our careers. Like, we'll never work in this town again, sort of deal. But we just couldn't, in good conscience, allow these remains to be, destroyed, just flagrantly destroyed. So that was our first kind of ethical conundrum. Our second ethical conundrum was, these remains did not want to be disturbed. This was not something that they intended or consented to back in, the 18th and 19th centuries. So, this is a pretty terrible situation. How can we bring good about in this situation? Like, how can we, and maybe in a bit we'll talk about some ethical frameworks, but there's one ethical framework which has to do with minimizing harm and maximizing good. So how can we strike that balance? How can we minimize the harm happening to these remains and maximize, benefit for both the remains and for the larger public and for the academic community as well? So, part of that has to do with the actual kind of subsequent analysis that happened to these remains. And our goal has really been to try to build stories. We're calling them osteobiographies, trying to use what is available to us of the physical individual, as well as the historical record, as well as other sort of scientific techniques that can give us insights into who this person is. What is their story? What was their life like? And, rather than making these individuals objects that just were salvaged or rescued or whatever, language you want to use, but turning them into people that we can have a relationship with. And that also kind of goes to some ethical frameworks, this idea of relationships and care. And part of that for us has been involving our students in the work, as well as doing analysis in the first place. So these remains aren't just like sitting in a dark storage room waiting to be reburied. There has been interaction with these remains between our researchers, between our students, to try to, again, build relationships between the past and the present, build stories, and maximize the benefit that could come from what was otherwise a terrible situation.
That's lovely. I really like the idea of having a relationship with the remains, and not just with the remains, but the people who used to be the remains.
Right. And that's something you lose when you don't work with actual human remains, when you don't involve actual human remains in teaching, or when you don't have them on display. One of the many books that I have in my office is a book on ethics and professionalism in forensic anthropology. It's written by Nicholas Pascalaqua. I always say his name wrong, and Marion Pilloud. And it's not a very big book. It's pretty thin, but it's got some real treasures in here. And one of the things that I really like is, so Europe generally, but also the United Kingdom, has dealt with these issues like generations before we've even been thinking about them. And I've studied in the United Kingdom. One of the things that happened in the UK when I was over there is it came to light that medical doctors were holding on to human tissue after death, after transplants, all sorts of stuff. And again, children were kind of involved. And using them for research and stuff like that. And there was a huge backlash. And what resulted is something called the Human Tissue Act. And the Human Tissue Act is very reactionary. And it's tightened up what can and cannot be done with human tissue, including human remains, to the point where it's really stifled a lot of research and work and education and stuff like that. So there are models out there to look towards that are both good and bad. Like, there are aspects of the Human Tissue Act that are really great and really wonderful and really necessary, but it also shows kind of what can happen within legislation when things kind of swing in a reactionary way. But anyway, one of the things that's in this book is a statement that was developed by the United Kingdom called Guidance for the Care of Human Remains in Museums. This is from 2005. And it states that the primary reason for museums to display remains are, in quotes, to educate medical practitioners, to educate people in science and history, to explain burial practices, and to bring people into physical contact with past people, and to encourage reflection, end quote. And I do think that's really profound and really important, and something that maybe we need to think about as we start to reassess, in this instance, human remains as displayed in museums.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's definitely something that I feel would be missing from putting human remains in, a gilded cage or making them inaccessible. Um, I just find that Western society in general lacks a relationship with their dead, and that starts as soon as the person dies,
Yeah.
and then it continues. But other cultures across the world, they have very intimate relationships with their dead, with their ancestors.
Right, right.
And
Going
that
back to,
includes, yeah, that includes the human remains, whether
yeah,
they're buried or not, or somehow preserved. Sometimes they keep them in their home. Sometimes they're in a certain spot that they visit on a regular basis and they
yeah,
commune with.
yeah. Going back to my original field of kind of Near Eastern archaeology, there are numerous cultures that buried their ancestors under the floor of their houses. They literally
Right.
had them in their house, in perpetuity.
Yeah. So that the ability to have to start a relationship and continue a relationship if we choose,
Yeah,
I think that's paramount. And we shouldn't disallow ourselves from that possibility.
yeah, definitely, for sure.
So, when we look at kind of where we are now and these professional ethic frameworks and what happened with the remains from the move group, I just want to maybe take a moment and kind of get an environmental scan about what's going on now
Hmm.
from what you're seeing in the classroom, at the AAAs and what have
Hmm.
you. Can you give us a sense of what you're seeing right here, right now?
Sure. So, for some folks, it's just business as usual, right? There's not a whole lot of change that's happening. But in other areas, there's been a call to, or some folks have decided that it's best to just remove all human remains from the classroom, because we do have really, really excellent replicas now, that have all the detail that one would need to kind of do, education and training. So there's that. There are museums. So again, going back to the Muner Museum is now under new leadership, and there's been talk about removing human remains from display at the Muner Museum. The University of Pennsylvania just recently announced, their Museum of Anthropology and Archaeology. They will be taking all human remains off from display. So there's that. There's also, and this is not necessarily a bad thing, a reassessment of what, either teaching collections or museum collections, what we actually have in our collections and where did it come from. And what do we do when we find no provenience? We have no idea where it came from. It's just been there forever. Or when there are problematic proveniences. And that's a very good thing. We really should know what we have
Yes,
and
yes,
where
we
it
should.
came from, right? Right. So that is a good thing. But then, yeah, the more extreme kind of approaches have been just to remove everything from display, not use it in teaching. Already, and again, this is not a bad thing. We've been increasingly more cautious as to what images we use. And actually, I'll circle back kind of, with the art sheet material, and kind of one of the ways that my thinking has sort of changed. So when we first had the material from Art Street, we were very adamant that we do not allow pictures of like skulls, like full frontal facial skulls, because we had a lot of newspaper reporters, and of course, everyone wants a picture of a skull. And we were very clear, like, we want to be respectful for the remains. If you do take a picture, we want to make sure that the skull is like rotated away from the camera, or just don't take any pictures at all if you can help it, that kind of thing. But I've since sort of changed my thinking. And again, this has to do with some of the teaching that I've now done with ethics and my exploration of moral philosophy and moral philosophers. And there's some philosophers that, again, talk about the human connection and seeing people as subjects instead of objects, meaning a subject as a person in their own right with their own story and their own individuality as opposed to an object. And I think that's very important, particularly when it comes to skulls, because we've objectified skulls forever. I mean, we're coming up to Halloween, right? What do we see everywhere? Skeletons and skulls. So, there's that. And then there's another moral philosopher who was around during World War II and was in a concentration camp and spoke a lot about looking an individual in the eyes. And when you look someone in the eyes, you connect with their humanity. And I really thought about that when it comes to skulls. If we're turning the skull away from the camera, what are we saying about that? What are we making it an object and not an individual? If we actually look into the eyes of this person, of what remains of this person, does that elicit more of a connection with this individual? So I've since kind of, like, I'm not taking pictures of skulls and posting them everywhere, clearly, but, I now have kind of maybe a different attitude towards if we were to take a picture of a skull and to have it, full frontal, that kind of connection. So I don't know. That's something that's been on my mind recently.
Yeah. I completely see your point, and there may not be an answer. I mean, this doesn't seem like a black and white.
Right. Well, type. And that is the interesting thing about ethics, is that many times in these ethical situations, there is no right answer. What makes you ethical is thinking about it and grappling with it and discussing it, because there might not be a clear yes or no, because I still haven't decided what, I'm not in a position where anyone's asking to take pictures of a skull, but I certainly haven't decided what I would do in that particular, I guess it would depend on the situation. But part of really embracing ethics within this field, again, is thinking about it, talking about it, not just kind of having, one sentence off the cuff, dismissive kind of attitude. It's really about grappling deeply with these issues.
Right. And I think that brings us kind of full circle to where we started about, the current climate about people not wanting to post any pictures, not work their remains, no nothing. It's like, okay, well, why is that? Can we please discuss this? What is your thinking around this? Why do you want to do this? And there is a lot of fear, but at the same time, nobody really seems to be willing to, or even able to talk about why they want to do it. They just say it's wrong. Okay, well, why is it wrong? What is your perception on this?
Right. So that's really important, is whenever we do make a decision, an ethical decision of yes or no, right or wrong, we really need to be able to articulate the reasoning behind that. Because if you can't, then it's not really ethical, right? It's dogmatism.
Right.
So I just kind of want to briefly go through some of the ethical frameworks from moral philosophy.
Yes, please.
They really give us the rationale, and they give us the ability to debate these things back and forth. Again, there might not be a clear answer, but at least you have the logical trail that has led you to where you are. So I got really interested in ethics thanks to the Society of American Archaeology. They have an ethics bowl, and I've now seen more organizations have ethics bowls as part of their annual conference. And the way that an ethics bowl works is you have two teams. They're presented with a scenario, an ethical dilemma. And if it's well written, there shouldn't be a clear answer. It should truly be a dilemma that, really sparks the debate. And then the two teams basically debate it out in front of a panel of judges, and the panel really kind of decides who made the best argument, not necessarily who had the right answer, but who made the best argument. And I've been a moderator for the Ethics Bowl for many, many years. And I always thought, this would make a really great class to actually talk about ethical dilemmas and moral philosophy, and then have this class culminate in the debate. And so, coincidentally, when everything was happening with ArchStreet, that semester, I also started working with a colleague of mine in our philosophy department to set up this course. And so I was very much kind of learning by doing. And this course is now run for 6 years. This year will be the 7th year that we run this course. It's now become a fixture. It's called Debating Ethical Issues Across Disciplines. And what we do is we introduce the students to the 4 main ethical frameworks within moral philosophy. The textbook that we use is a 21st Century Ethical Toolbox by Anthony Weston. Highly recommend this book. It's a really easy way to kind of introduce yourself to moral philosophy and these various frameworks. So the first framework is probably the one that is the easiest to connect to all this discussion with human remains. And this is, and I'm just going to use the terminology used in the textbook. This is what's referred to as the ethics of the person. So this is grounded in mainly Immanuel Kant as our main kind of philosopher. And it's this framework that gives us justice and rights. It basically says that, people are individual and they are deserving of respect and to be treated with dignity. And so you can already see how this totally connects with everything that we're talking about with human remains. There's some other interesting aspects about the ethics of the person, or particularly about Immanuel Kant's various, philosophies. And one of them is this idea of universality, that for something to be ethical, you should be able to have it applied in every situation. You should be okay with a universal kind of doctrine. And that can be quite difficult in a lot of different ways. But, we might circle back to that. But basically, ethics of the person, the idea of dignity, rights, respect, justice, all that sort of stuff. The next framework is, using this textbook, is called the ethics of happiness. And this is where we get to Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill and, utilitarianism or consequentialism, which has to do with, we often think of the greatest good for the greatest number of people, but really it's about maximizing good or happiness, happiness, good kind of synonyms, and minimizing harm. And in this particular framework, and this is one that we use all the time, democracy is kind of based on this framework. There are trade-offs. There's always going to be winners and losers in this particular framework. Not everybody is going to be happy, but you're trying to create the most happiness, the greatest amount of good. And so we see this in a lot of different ways. And I kind of referred to it earlier about how in this bad situation, we were just trying to reduce harm as much as possible and try to, again, maximize good with our efforts. The third framework is the ethics of virtue. This is our oldest framework. It goes all the way back to Aristotle. And it's all about character traits, humaning well, being the best humans that we can be. So being honest, being transparent, being hardworking. I mean, you go on and on and on with the list of virtues. And so being an ethical person means exercising these virtues, these character traits. So as an archaeologist, how do I archaeology well? And, that would be communication and outreach. Again, honesty, not misrepresenting my qualifications, transparency, hardworking, good practice, all the rest of it. And our last ethical framework is sometimes called kind of the feminist ethical framework. So all these other frameworks tend to be much more centered on kind of justice and more of a kind of masculine approach. This last one is often considered the more feminine approach, and it's grounded in the work of Carol Gilligan and Nell Noddings. And it's often called the ethics of care or the ethics of relationships. And the idea is that we all live in communities, and being ethical is about the care and the stewardship of relationships. It's really interesting. Carol Gilligan just came out. Her seminal book is called In a Different Voice, and it has to do with research in psychology that she was participating in that was looking at kind of moral development. And they were looking at boys and giving boys, certain questions and seeing how they answered those questions. And again, the boys tended to approach it by like justice and this is what's right and following the law and stuff like that. Whereas the girls tended to have a more nuanced approach and like, well, what are the responsibilities that the different actors have to each other? And at the time, the girls were seen as less morally developed because they didn't have clear answers, because they had this more nuanced approach. And Carol Gilligan really realized that it wasn't that they were underdeveloped, it was that they thought of these things differently. And so she wrote this book in a different voice, and that's really kind of changed a lot of our mindset. Now, she's just recently come out with a new book that basically says that this isn't a feminist approach. This is just a human approach.
Mm-hmm.
Making it feminist means that you're like cutting out half the population.
Right.
That we all have the ability to think about care and relationships.
Right.
So again, thinking about human remains, our care of them, our stewardship of them, how we use them, that we're not using them,
Right.
that we're building relationships with them and our students and so forth. So using these 4 frameworks, sometimes these frameworks work together very nicely. Sometimes these frameworks kind of butt up against each other. But the important thing is to, whatever your decision is with human remains, to try to view that through one or more of these lenses as your rationale. So with the Art Street material, we decided to learn from the remains, to study the remains. We felt like, first of all, we could do this by preserving the human dignity, that it was actually more dignified for us to learn from these individuals and tell their stories and see them as people and not as objects. We felt like we were maximizing the good that could be created from this situation. We felt like, as archaeologists, that, practicing the virtues of what makes a good archaeologist is to, again, create knowledge in a way that preserves dignity. That just putting these things in a storage container isn't archaeology well. And then also the idea of relationships, that we were creating relationships between the past and the present, that we were stewarding these remains. So, that was our justification for one way for us to kind of create the rationale of the approach that we had.
Right. Just reflecting on what you've been talking about, one of the biggest things that I learned from studying anthropology is that different groups will have different perspectives.
Yes.
And that anthropology, as an anthropologist, I need to realize that and respect that.
Yes.
And in dealing with ethics, different groups will have different perspectives,
right,
including anthropologists.
Yeah.
And we have a different view of working with remains, and different groups of anthropologists will probably have different perspectives on working with human remains. And I think, using that to put the lens on ourselves so that we can respect the different viewpoints and talk about them.
Yeah.
That may not be the most natural for us to do, but I think it's turning our discipline upon ourselves.
Yes. Yeah. I've been to many a conference that has ended up in, raised voices and, kind of anger issues amongst anthropologists that are supposed to be having a civilized debate. And it just kind of,
spirals
apart. Yeah.
Well, I'm conscious of the time, so I don't want to keep you too much longer, but this has been amazing food for thought. And I really hope that listeners go away with a lot of questions, which is good.
Right. And again, engage with these ethical frameworks. There may be, and probably are, very good arguments of why we shouldn't do certain things with remains. I mean, again, we were talking about different cultural groups. Going back to respect and dignity has to do with, honoring the wishes of next of kin and cultural perspectives. So yeah, definitely, think these things through. Part of ethics is all about thinking. So if you want to be an ethical archaeologist, anthropologist person really engage deeply instead of just trying to find easy answers. There are no easy answers.
Well, that's too bad. I was hoping for an easy answer out of this, but
That's
yeah.
no fun. An easy answer is no fun.
The fun is the journey.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for this. This has been wonderful.
Oh, my pleasure. I mean, these are issues that are near and dear to my heart, and I do love talking about them and engaging with them. So thank you so much for giving me this time and this space.
I hope you've enjoyed listening to this episode. Please leave a rating or review and share this episode and podcast with your friends, family, and colleagues.